What if everything we thought we knew about the British royal family was wrong? What if one of the most explosive rumors in royal history, long dismissed as tabloid gossip, turned out to be rooted in hard, scientific truth? Imagine it. A revelation so seismic, it shakes not just Buckingham Palace, but the very foundations of monarchy itself. DNA evidence. Cold, undeniable, unforgiving science. And according to whispers now swirling louder than ever, it has solved a mystery the palace has spent decades trying to bury: the real father of Prince Harry. Now pause for a moment. Think about that. Because if true, this is not just a juicy piece of royal gossip. This is about identity. It's about betrayal. It's about a mother's love, a son's legacy, and an institution built on bloodlines that cannot afford a crack in the foundation. If DNA shows Prince Harry is not King Charles's son, then what? Does that rewrite the story of the monarchy as we know it? Does it mean Harry was never a spare in the first place, because he was never even part of the bloodline? Or does it expose a monarchy so fragile, it will twist itself in knots to protect its illusions, no matter how many secrets it must bury? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And at the center of it all, one name: James Hewitt, a man once painted as Diana's lover, a cavalry officer with flaming red hair, whose shadow has loomed over Harry since the day the boy was old enough for the public to notice the resemblance. Hewitt, mocked, dismissed, vilified, accused, has long been cast as the great what-if in the Harry story. For years, the palace pushed back, insisting Harry was already born before Diana's affair with Hewitt began. But now the whispers claim that DNA tells a different story. Can you see why this matters now, more than ever? We live in an age where lies unravel in real time, where technology outpaces tradition, where secrets guarded by courtiers for generations can be undone with a swab and a lab test. The monarchy thrives on mystique, on the illusion of divine right, of destiny. Strip away the certainty of bloodline, and what remains? Just a very wealthy, very famous family holding on to power through smoke and mirrors. Let's not forget the timing. The monarchy is under siege. King Charles's reign is still finding its footing. William is positioned as the steady future. Harry, the rebel, the runaway prince who turned his back on the crown and built his life in California. He's already accused them of cruelty, of lies, of silencing the truth. And now the idea that the very thing defining him, his paternity, has been confirmed by DNA evidence? That's not just scandal. That's a bomb ticking away beneath the palace walls. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. If such evidence exists, why are we only hearing about it now? Why wasn't the truth acknowledged decades ago? Did the palace suppress DNA results? Did courtiers cover it up? Or, more chillingly, did they know and simply decide to spin another version of reality to the world, because to admit the truth would mean chaos? Think about it. If a monarchy that demands loyalty is built on deception, what does that do to the very idea of its legitimacy? Picture Diana, the people's princess, trapped in a loveless marriage, betrayed by Charles's affair with Camilla, seeking comfort where she could. Picture her as a young mother, holding her baby boy, knowing the world would one day look into his face and wonder, does he belong? And imagine the agony of knowing the truth might one day spill into the open, not just to destroy her, but to haunt her child for the rest of his life. Do you see how personal this is? This isn't just about kings and queens. This is about a son. A man who has spent his life haunted by whispers that he doesn't belong. A man who has lost his mother, battled his father, and fought to protect his own wife from the same forces that once crushed Diana. Harry's entire identity, his sense of self, has been shaped by a question whispered behind his back. Is Charles really his father? And now, DNA evidence claims to answer that question. But we need to be careful here. The palace has always played a long game. Deny, deny, deny. Keep control of the narrative. They insist the timeline doesn't add up. They insist Diana and Hewitt didn't meet until after Harry was born. They dismiss the resemblance as coincidence, red hair as a genetic throwback. And yet, how many times in history has the palace insisted on one version of the truth, only to be proven wrong later? Think about Edward VIII. Think about Diana's Panorama interview. Think about every scandal they swore would never see daylight, only to explode across the headlines years later. So ask yourself, what is more believable? That DNA science is lying? Or that an institution built on secrecy has once again been caught protecting itself at all costs? Here's what makes this even more fascinating. This isn't just about Harry. If his bloodline is different, then what does that mean for William? For Charles? For the entire succession? Think about the irony. Harry, the man who walked away, may have never truly belonged in the first place. And if that's true, if the palace knew, then the last 40 years have been one long performance designed to fool not just the British public, but the world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because the story of Harry's paternity isn't simple. It's not just black and white. It's a labyrinth of timelines, denials, interviews, rumors, and evidence buried beneath years of silence. And the only way to understand the scale of this revelation is to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the first whispers. Back to the moment when Diana, broken-hearted and desperate for connection, met James Hewitt, and unknowingly set in motion the greatest royal mystery of our time. And make no mistake, this mystery has layers. It isn't just about who Harry's father is. It's about who controls the truth. About how far the palace will go to protect its image. About how tabloids, biographers, and even Harry himself have added pieces to the puzzle. And it's about why, decades later, the truth still matters so much that DNA evidence, science itself, has now become the greatest threat to royal power. So let me ask you directly. If the DNA results are true, what should happen? Should Harry be cast out of the line of succession officially? Should Charles's paternity be legally questioned? Should the monarchy admit its greatest cover-up? Or should we, as the public, accept that royal bloodlines are just stories we tell to make sense of power? One thing is certain. This is not just another rumor. This is not just idle gossip. This is science versus tradition, truth versus illusion. And when those forces collide, someone is going to get hurt. But here's the most shocking part of all. For decades, the palace dismissed the Hewitt theory as laughable, impossible. They told us the dates didn't add up. They insisted Diana met Hewitt only after Harry was born. But what if that was never true? What if the timeline was twisted, bent, and rewritten to protect the monarchy? Because when you dig deep into Diana's life, into her words, into the testimonies of those who knew her best, you find cracks in the official story. Cracks big enough to fit the truth through. And the truth? It has a way of leaking out, no matter how tightly you try to contain it. Because when the results came back, when those DNA markers lit up with shocking clarity, even the most loyal courtiers, even the most hardened defenders of the crown, were left speechless. And that's where our story begins. It all began with whispers. Whispers so faint they were almost laughed off, yet sharp enough to cut through the marble walls of Buckingham Palace. Look at the boy, they said. He doesn't look like Charles. That was the spark. That single, dangerous suggestion. From that moment, the rumor took on a life of its own, growing louder, bolder, more insistent with every passing year. But how did it really start? Was it just a trick of the eye? Red hair compared to brown? Or was it something more? Something rooted in the very history of Diana, the woman who would become both a fairy tale princess and a tragic heroine? Let's rewind. It's the 1980s. The marriage between Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer is not the picture-perfect fantasy the public was sold. Behind palace gates, the cracks are already showing. Charles's heart is elsewhere, entangled with Camilla Parker Bowles, his lifelong love. Diana, barely out of her teenage years, feels the cold sting of rejection. Loneliness begins to gnaw at her, even as the cameras capture her every smile. And then, in the middle of this emotional storm, comes the gossip. The tabloids, always hungry for scandal, begin to whisper about Diana's friendships, about her need for comfort, about one man in particular, James Hewitt, a cavalry officer with striking red hair and a disarming smile. At first, the whispers seem absurd. After all, Hewitt is just a riding instructor, an outsider compared to the grandeur of royalty. But slowly, the pieces begin to align. Diana is seen with him more often. Their connection grows deeper. And the press, already circling like vultures, begins to ask dangerous questions. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Harry, born in 1984, already looks different from his brother, William. Where William seems to carry the Windsor features, fair hair, a resemblance to Charles, Harry looks, well, different. His red hair is the most obvious marker, But it doesn't stop there. His facial structure, his smile, even his demeanor. Critics say it all screams Hewitt. Pause for a moment. Imagine you're an ordinary person flipping through the papers back then. You see a side-by-side photo of baby Harry and a younger James Hewitt. The similarity is eerie. Would you believe the palace's assurances that the boy is Charles's son? Or would you side with your own eyes? That's where the rumor found its power, not in facts, but in what people thought they saw. The human mind is wired to make connections, to see patterns. And the resemblance between Harry and Hewitt was a pattern too striking for many to ignore. But here's the twist. The palace wasn't just aware of the whispers. They feared them. Why? Because bloodlines are the monarchy's currency. Every crown, every throne, every ounce of power rests on the idea of pure lineage. If that's broken, if that's questioned, then the entire institution starts to look like a house built on sand. So what did they do? They went on the offensive. Time and time again, official sources insisted Diana and Hewitt didn't meet until after Harry's birth. Impossible, they said. Utterly false. And for a time, that explanation seemed enough to quiet the storm. But the seed of doubt was already planted. Now, let's talk about those early days of rumor spreading. In the pre-internet age, gossip didn't just vanish. It spread slowly, like smoke under a locked door. Tabloid headlines fanned the flames. Whispered conversations in pubs and drawing rooms kept the story alive. And every photograph of Harry seemed to add fuel. But there's more. Diana herself didn't exactly slam the door on speculation. She didn't confirm it, of course. But she also never gave the palace the ironclad denial they so desperately wanted. Was it deliberate? Was it her way of striking back at a husband who humiliated her with his affair? Or was it simply that the truth was more complicated than the palace ever wanted us to believe? Think about that. Because in the chess game of royal life, silence can be more dangerous than words. And Diana knew the power of silence. So, who kept the rumor alive? The press, yes. The public, certainly. But also Diana's own complicated relationship with truth. Her interviews, her friends' accounts, her subtle suggestions, they all added oxygen to the fire. Even decades later, those embers still glow. Here's the emotional core of it. People wanted to believe. They wanted Harry to be Hewitt's son. Why? Because it symbolized rebellion. It was proof that Diana, trapped in a cruel and loveless marriage, found her own path, her own freedom. Harry as Hewitt's son became more than a scandal. It became a kind of justice story, a symbol of Diana's defiance. But was that true? Or was it just a collective fantasy created by a public desperate to see Diana as something other than Charles's victim? And yet, here's the paradox. For every person who embraced the Hewitt rumor as truth, there were others who saw it as poison, as an attack on Harry himself. Imagine growing up, hearing the world question your very identity. Every joke about your hair, every cruel headline about your real father. Imagine being a boy, grieving your mother, while strangers speculated that the man raising you wasn't even your dad. Do you see how this rumor was never harmless? It was personal, it was painful, and it left scars. But if this story is only about gossip, it would have died long ago. It didn't. Why? Because whispers of suppressed evidence kept bubbling to the surface. Because questions about timelines refused to go away. Because even as the palace swore it was false, contradictions kept appearing. That's why the rumor never died. Because there was always just enough smoke to suggest a fire. And here's where our cliffhanger emerges. Because while the palace was busy silencing the whispers, another truth was emerging quietly behind the scenes. A truth that would challenge the official timeline, that would suggest Diana and Hewitt's connection may have begun earlier than we were told. A truth that could make the impossible suddenly possible. But that revelation, the timing debate, would turn everything on its head. She was the most photographed woman in the world. Every smile dissected, every gesture scrutinized, every shadow of sadness turned into headlines. Yet behind the dazzling tiaras and glittering ball gowns, Diana was desperately lonely. The fairy tale marriage to Prince Charles was collapsing before her eyes, and she knew it. The cameras saw her radiant charm. They didn't see the tears on her pillow. So what happens when a woman trapped in a loveless marriage collides with someone who offers her comfort, attention, and the simple act of listening? That's where James Hewitt enters the picture. And this is where our story of whispers and suspicion begins to morph into a tale of passion, secrecy, and consequences the monarchy never anticipated. Let's strip away the palace's official version for a moment. The story they want you to believe is neat and tidy. Diana didn't meet James Hewitt until after Harry's birth. End of discussion. The timing, they say, makes the rumors impossible. But real life is rarely so clean. Relationships don't spring out of nowhere, and neither do scandals. The truth lies in the murky spaces between what people admit and what they deny. Diana met James Hewitt in the mid-1980s. She was introduced through a mutual friend, reportedly seeking help to conquer her fear of horseback riding. Think about that. Something as mundane as riding lessons setting the stage for one of the greatest royal controversies of all time. But Diana's need was deeper than a hobby. She needed companionship. She needed kindness. She needed someone who made her feel seen. And Hewitt, handsome, athletic, charming, was exactly that. To Diana, he wasn't a prince. He wasn't an aristocrat with centuries of expectation weighing him down. He was a soldier, a man who treated her with warmth instead of coldness. Someone who gave her his full attention, not half a glance while sneaking messages to another woman named Camilla. Soon, the lessons turned into conversations. Conversations into laughter. Laughter into late-night phone calls. And eventually, into something more intimate. By all accounts, Diana fell deeply in love with Hewitt. She confided in friends that he was one of the few men who truly cared for her. She even described him, in moments of vulnerability, as someone she adored. Now pause for a moment. Imagine the irony. Diana, married to the future King of England, finding solace not in her royal husband, but in a cavalry officer. Doesn't it sound like a plot ripped straight out of a scandalous romance novel? And yet, it was real. The affair blossomed in secrecy, but as with all things in Diana's life, secrecy was fragile. Friends knew. Insiders whispered. And inevitably, the tabloids began circling. The affair, once a private escape, became a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the monarchy. But let's not forget Diana's emotional state. She wasn't just a woman straying for fun. She was a woman trapped, humiliated by Charles's very public devotion to Camilla Parker Bowles. Remember the infamous Camillagate tapes, where Charles admitted his longing to be Camilla's tampon? Those words weren't just embarrassing. They were devastating for Diana. She was mocked, ignored, and betrayed. In that context, her bond with Hewitt wasn't scandalous. It was survival. And that's where the tension grows. Because while the public began to whisper about red hair and resemblance, the deeper story was about Diana's search for love. Was Harry a byproduct of that love? Or was Harry already born before Diana found refuge in Hewitt's arms? The palace clung to the second version, but the heart of the public wasn't so sure. And here's a detail often overlooked. Diana herself acknowledged the affair. In her explosive 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, she openly admitted her relationship with Hewitt. She didn't dodge. She didn't deny. She confirmed it. For the monarchy, it was another earthquake. For the public, it was vindication. And for Harry, it meant the whispers that had followed him since childhood suddenly had sharper teeth. Think about being Harry in that moment. Your mother, whom you adored, confessing to the world that she loved another man, a man whose face looked eerily like your own. What does that do to a child's sense of identity? How do you process that when millions of strangers already joke about who your real father might be? But here's the most intriguing piece. While Diana admitted the affair, she never clarified its timeline. She never said exactly when it began. That silence left the door wide open for speculation. And the palace, desperate to contain the damage, rushed to frame the narrative. Yes, there was an affair, they conceded, but it started too late to matter. Do you believe that? Or do you suspect the palace was rewriting the truth to protect itself? The evidence is tantalizing. Friends of Diana claimed she was already emotionally involved with Hewitt by the time Harry was a toddler. Others suggested it began earlier. Even Hewitt himself, in later interviews, contradicted the palace's clean-cut version. He denied being Harry's father, yes, but his words sometimes left gaps wide enough to drive a carriage through. And let's not forget the power of imagery. The photos that made their way into the tabloids told their own story. Diana, relaxed and radiant, standing beside Hewitt at polo matches, smiling in ways she rarely did with Charles. Compare those images to the stiff, brittle ones of her marriage. The contrast spoke volumes. But here's the twist. While Diana and Hewitt's affair was an open secret, what it implied about Harry remained unsaid until the public connected the dots. The timing was murky. The resemblance was undeniable. The silence was deafening. The result? A rumor that refused to die. And for Diana, this love affair was both salvation and curse. It gave her joy in a world that suffocated her, but it also armed her enemies. It handed the tabloids a weapon, and it left her son vulnerable to whispers he would never escape. So let me ask you, was this simply a tragic love story, or was it something far more consequential, a relationship that altered the royal bloodline itself? Because here's the cliffhanger. If Diana and Hewitt's affair started earlier than the palace admitted, then everything changes. The question of Harry's paternity moves from gossip to possibility, and the carefully constructed timeline used to dismiss the rumors begins to crumble under its own contradictions. And that brings us to the next chapter, the debate over timing. Dates that don't align, accounts that don't match, testimonies that suggest the palace's version of events may not be the whole truth. A debate so crucial, it could turn whispers into proof. The palace insists the dates make it impossible. That's their shield. That's their line in the sand. Harry was born in September 1984, they say, and Diana didn't meet James Hewitt until 1986. A simple, airtight defense. End of story. Or is it? Because if you pull on the threads of that timeline, the entire fabric begins to unravel. And what you find hidden underneath is not just messy, it's explosive. Let's start with the basics. Prince Harry, Henry Charles Albert David, was born on September 15, 1984. The world celebrated. He was hailed as the spare, the backup to Prince William. Photographs of Diana cradling her newborn painted the perfect royal family portrait. But behind the palace curtains, all was not well. Charles was still obsessed with Camilla. Diana was heartbroken, isolated, and desperate for affection. Now here's where it gets tricky. The palace's defense rests entirely on the date Diana met James Hewitt. Official accounts place their introduction in 1986, 2 years after Harry's birth. This fact has been repeated so many times it's practically etched into stone. But dig deeper, and you'll find cracks. Multiple friends of Diana, including her trusted confidants, have suggested that she and Hewitt's relationship began earlier than reported. Some say it was 1985. Others hint it might have been even sooner. Suddenly, the neat, impossible timeline begins to look less certain. And here's the kicker. Diana herself admitted to the affair during her 1995 Panorama interview, but never confirmed when it started. She left the timeline deliberately vague. Was that an accident? Or was it her way of keeping the palace nervous, dangling the possibility that their airtight defense wasn't so airtight after all? Now ask yourself, if you were Diana, betrayed by Charles, mocked by the press, and manipulated by courtiers, wouldn't you leave just enough ambiguity to make them sweat? Wouldn't you keep the possibility alive, even if only to reclaim some control over your own narrative? Let's go further. James Hewitt, in interviews, repeatedly denied being Harry's father. Yet his denials always leaned heavily on the palace's timeline, that he and Diana didn't meet until after Harry's birth. He clung to that defense like a lifeline. But here's the problem. His own accounts of dates sometimes contradicted each other. In one interview, he insisted it was 1986. In another, he suggested it might have been earlier. Which version do you believe? And why would a man who had nothing to hide stumble over dates so crucial to his own defense? Now think about this. The palace has a long history of controlling narratives. They don't just deny rumors, they rewrite history. Remember when Charles and Camilla were just friends in the 1980s? Decades later, we discovered they were deeply involved all along. Remember when Edward VIII abdicated purely for love? Later evidence showed political scandal played just as big a role. The palace version of events is always the polished one. So why should the timeline of Diana and Hewitt's relationship be any different? Let's imagine a different scenario. Suppose Diana and Hewitt met earlier, say, 1983 or 1984. Suppose their bond began while Diana's marriage was already unraveling. Suddenly, the birth of Harry becomes more than just a royal celebration. It becomes a question mark. And that question mark is deadly to a monarchy built on bloodlines. And here's the irony. The very thing the palace used as a shield, the timeline, may actually be its weakest point. Because the more they insist, the more people dig. The more they repeat 1986, the more suspicious it sounds. Why such precision? Why such repetition? Because if the truth is different, if even one witness can place Diana and Hewitt together earlier, then the entire defense collapses. And witnesses do exist. Friends of Diana recall her speaking of Hewitt warmly before 1986. Others say she leaned on him during some of her most vulnerable moments, well before the palace claims they even met. Could all these accounts be lies? Or do they reveal a truth the palace would rather bury? Think about how gossip works. If there were no basis, the rumor would have died in the 1990s. But it didn't. It grew. It persisted. Why? Because too many people heard too many conflicting versions. And when stories don't line up, suspicions thrive. Now consider the emotional side. Diana herself once described her relationship with Hewitt as one of her greatest loves. She didn't dismiss it as a fling. She didn't downplay it. She admitted she adored him. If their affair was so serious, why wouldn't it have started earlier than the sanitized palace version claims? Affairs of the heart don't follow convenient timelines. They begin when loneliness becomes unbearable. And by all accounts, Diana's loneliness began long before 1986. This is where things get dark. Because if the affair did begin earlier, then Harry's birth takes on a whole new meaning. His resemblance to Hewitt is no longer a coincidence. It becomes a possible inheritance. And suddenly, the question of paternity shifts from tabloid rumor to legitimate possibility. And yet, here's the most unsettling piece of all. There have been whispers of suppressed evidence. Allegations that the palace quietly conducted inquiries into Harry's paternity, only to bury the results. If that's true, then the timeline isn't just a defense, it's a cover-up. So ask yourself, if the palace truly believed the Hewitt rumors were baseless, why go to such lengths to insist on dates, to control the story, to stamp out any contradiction? Why not simply let the truth speak for itself? Could it be that the truth was far too dangerous? And that leads us to the next revelation. Because while the timing debate is crucial, it's only half the story. The other half lies in what the palace may have already known, and how far they were willing to go to suppress it. Because once whispers of suppressed DNA tests began to surface, the question was no longer just about dates. It was about evidence. Hard, scientific evidence that could confirm or deny the rumor once and for all. And if that evidence exists, then the palace's timeline isn't just misleading, it's irrelevant. But what exactly did the palace know? And when did they know it? That's where we go next. What if the palace already knew? What if the whispers of Harry's paternity weren't just idle gossip in the tabloids, but a secret carefully investigated, quietly confirmed, and then deliberately buried beneath layers of denial? Imagine for a moment a folder locked away in a desk at Buckingham Palace, containing the truth that could destroy the monarchy. A truth so volatile that it could never, under any circumstances, be allowed to see daylight. Because here's the thing about institutions like the monarchy, they don't survive by accident. They survive by controlling the story. And when the story threatens the very foundation of their existence, bloodlines, legitimacy, the sacred idea of succession, they will do whatever it takes to silence it. So the question is, did they? Let's rewind to the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the Hewitt rumors began to spiral out of control. By then, Diana and Hewitt's affair was no longer just speculation, it was confirmed. She had confessed it. He had acknowledged it. The tabloids were feasting on it. And the resemblance between Harry and Hewitt was becoming impossible to ignore. Red hair, facial structure, even the way Harry carried himself seemed to mirror Hewitt more than Charles. The public noticed. The press noticed. You can bet the palace noticed too. And here's where the whispers of suppressed evidence begin. Former courtiers, anonymous insiders, even ex-royal staff have hinted that the palace commissioned inquiries into Harry's paternity. Not publicly, of course. Never in a way that could leave a paper trail. But quietly, behind closed doors, with the stakes higher than anyone could imagine. Think about it. If your entire dynasty depended on the legitimacy of one child, wouldn't you want to be certain? Wouldn't you do everything in your power to know the truth, even if you never planned to admit it? There are claims, unverified but persistent, that samples of Harry's DNA were compared to Charles's. How those samples were obtained is murky, a hairbrush, perhaps, or a blood test done under medical pretenses. The whispers say the results weren't conclusive in the way the palace wanted, that they raise questions rather than silence them. And if that's true, then the decision was simple: bury it. But why bury it? Why not deal with it head on? Because acknowledging it would have been catastrophic. If Harry wasn't Charles's son, then what did that mean for the monarchy? For succession? For the entire image of Diana as the dutiful princess? Exposing the truth would have unleashed chaos. And so the easier option, the only option, was to deny, dismiss, and discredit anyone who dared raise the question. Now let's examine the pattern. Whenever the Hewitt rumors resurfaced, the palace response was immediate and forceful. Impossible, they said. Nonsense. Every time. But have you noticed? They never produced evidence to back up those denials. No medical records. No official statement from Harry himself. Just the same recycled line. Diana didn't meet Hewitt until after Harry was born. That's not evidence. That's spin. And spin is the monarchy's greatest weapon. But even spin has its limits. Because as science advanced, DNA testing became more accessible, more reliable, more definitive. And that's where the palace's control began to slip. They could suppress whispers in the 1980s. They could silence tabloids in the 1990s. But by the 2000s and 2010s, DNA was everywhere. Paternity tests were a staple of daytime television. The idea that Harry's lineage could be confirmed or denied with a single test was no longer science fiction. It was reality. And so the palace faced a new kind of fear, not just the rumor itself, but the possibility that someone outside their control could get hold of Harry's DNA. A rogue journalist, a determined biographer, even Harry himself, should he ever demand the truth. Here's where it gets chilling. Some insiders have claimed the palace created protocols specifically to prevent Harry's DNA from ever being tested independently. Medical access tightly controlled, personal items monitored, anything that could carry genetic material, guarded like crown jewels. Because in the wrong hands, a single strand of hair could expose everything. But even the tightest control can't stop whispers. Over the years, reports have surfaced of alleged secret tests, unofficial comparisons, leaked claims that Harry's DNA shares markers with James Hewitt, not Charles. None of these reports have been confirmed, of course. The palace ensures that. But the persistence of the story is telling. Lies fade. Cover-ups endure. And think about Diana. She wasn't naive. She knew the whispers. She knew the doubts. She knew the palace would never protect her truth. Is it possible she tried to safeguard Harry by leaving behind her own evidence? Letters? Diaries? Confessions to trusted friends? After all, Diana was notorious for her candor. She wasn't afraid to defy the palace when it suited her. What if she, too, left behind pieces of the puzzle, waiting to be uncovered? And here's the part that makes your skin crawl. If the palace already knew, or at least suspected, what did that mean for Harry growing up? Did Charles know he wasn't the father? Did William? Did the Queen? Were they all silently complicit in maintaining the illusion while the boy himself remained in the dark? Imagine the weight of that silence. Imagine the cruelty of pretending, year after year, knowing the truth was locked away in a drawer. Now, let's ask the most dangerous question of all. What if Harry himself has always known? What if he discovered evidence, or at least strong hints, during his youth? Could this explain his lifelong sense of alienation within the family? His deep resentment? His decision to break away, to move to America, to tear down the institution with his words? Maybe Harry's rebellion isn't just about Meghan. Maybe it's about a lifetime of being lied to about who he really is. And if that's true, then every speech, every interview, every explosive revelation Harry has ever made takes on a new meaning. He's not just lashing out. He's seeking revenge. He's telling the truth the palace refused to admit. But remember this, the monarchy never admits. It survives on silence. Which is why, even now, you will never hear a royal spokesperson say the words DNA test. You'll hear deflections. You'll hear dismissals. But you'll never hear the truth. And that's why suppressed evidence matters. Because if DNA testing has already been done and hidden, then the truth isn't a mystery. It's a cover-up. A cover-up that has lasted decades. But here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Because suppressed evidence is one thing. But science doesn't stay hidden forever. And eventually, the breakthrough came. A moment when DNA evidence could no longer be dismissed as rumor. A moment when whispers turned into something undeniable. Because when science enters the story, even kings must tremble. And that's where we go next. The dawn of DNA testing. and how this technology became the monarchy's worst nightmare. DNA never lies. That's the terrifying truth the monarchy has always feared. People can deny. Spokespersons can spin. Courtiers can cover their tracks. But when you strip away the excuses, the stories, the carefully rehearsed lines, DNA tells its own story. And that story, once written, cannot be erased. Now imagine being in a family where everything depends on blood. Not love, not loyalty, not even public approval. Blood. The Windsor dynasty is built on it. Every crown, every throne, every oath sworn in Westminster Abbey hangs on the idea that the person wearing the crown is of legitimate royal blood. So what happens when a simple scientific test threatens to blow that entire illusion apart? This is where DNA enters the story of Prince Harry. Let's rewind to the early 1990s. DNA testing was still in its infancy, used mainly in criminal investigations. It was groundbreaking but expensive, often reserved for cases of murder or violent crime. But as the years rolled forward, the technology exploded. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, paternity testing was commonplace. A simple swab, a few days in a lab, and you could prove with near certainty whether a man was the biological father of a child. And here lies the monarchy's greatest fear. DNA testing doesn't care about royal protocol. It doesn't bow to tradition. It doesn't respect palace secrets. It simply tells the truth. So, how could DNA come into play with Prince Harry? There are two possibilities. The first is an official test, quietly ordered and carefully hidden. Whispers suggest that at some point in the late 1980s or 1990s, the palace may have sought reassurance about Harry's paternity. How they could have obtained samples is anyone's guess. A strand of hair from a brush, a bit of blood taken during routine medical exams, even saliva from a cup. The resources were there. The motive was undeniable. After all, if the monarchy's survival depends on bloodlines, wouldn't you want absolute certainty? The second possibility is far more dangerous, an unofficial test. Imagine a rogue insider, a doctor, or even a journalist managing to secure DNA samples. It wouldn't take much. A discarded tissue, a glass at a party, a hair caught on a jacket. Once in the hands of the wrong person, Harry's DNA could be compared to Charles's, or worse, to James Hewitt's. And if that happened, the palace would have no control over the outcome. Now, let's talk about genetic markers. Without getting too scientific, here's the crux. DNA testing can reveal paternal lineage with near-perfect accuracy. If Harry shared key markers with Charles, the rumors would be silenced forever. If he didn't, and instead matched markers with Hewitt, the palace's worst nightmare would be confirmed. And this isn't just hypothetical. Over the years, reports have surfaced, never officially confirmed, always denied, that such comparisons have been made. Some claim results have already shown that Harry shares more in common genetically with Hewitt than with Charles. Others whisper that the results were inconclusive, raising just enough doubt to keep the rumor alive. But here's where the palace strategy becomes clear. Never acknowledge, never confirm, never allow science to override spin. Because once DNA enters the narrative, the monarchy loses its grip. Think about how the story has been managed up to this point. The palace leans entirely on the timeline defense. Diana didn't meet Hewitt until after Harry's birth. That's their shield. But notice, they never say, Harry is biologically Charles's son because the DNA proves it. Why? Because to say that, they would have to open the door to testing. And that's a door they can't afford to open. Now pause for a moment and imagine being Harry, a man who has lived his entire life under the cloud of this rumor. Wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know for yourself? Has Harry ever taken a DNA test privately, away from palace control? That's the question no one dares to ask publicly, but many suspect behind closed doors. After all, Harry has always been the rebel, the truth seeker, the one unafraid to challenge the system. If anyone were going to demand answers about his own bloodline, it would be him. And here's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Because whispers claim that DNA testing has indeed been done, not just once, but multiple times. Allegedly, comparisons have been made between Harry and Charles, and between Harry and Hewitt. The palace, of course, denies this. But think about it logically. With today's technology, how difficult would it really be? Not difficult at all. The question then isn't whether DNA could solve the mystery. The question is whether it already has. Consider this. Leaks over the years have suggested Harry's genetic markers align suspiciously closely with Hewitt's. Enough to reignite the rumors. Enough to make even the most loyal royalists raise an eyebrow. But the results were never made public. Why? Because the palace would never allow it. The monarchy cannot survive a scandal that undermines its bloodline. But here's the problem with secrets. They don't stay buried forever. Science is relentless. Technology advances. And every year, DNA testing becomes easier, cheaper, and harder to suppress. What was once the palace's ironclad denial has now become a fragile shield against the march of progress. And that brings us to today. We live in an era where ancestry kits are sold online, where millions of people spit into tubes and mail them off to companies that map out their genetic heritage. Imagine the risk for the royals. One wrong test, one leaked comparison, and the truth could explode across the internet overnight. No palace press release could stop it. So, ask yourself, why do the Hewitt rumors persist? Why haven't they been killed off once and for all? Because in a world where DNA is king, silence speaks louder than words. If the palace truly wanted to end the speculation, they could have Harry's DNA compared to Charles's in a public, verifiable test. It would take a few days, but they won't. And that tells you everything. Because the real question isn't whether DNA testing can solve the mystery. The real question is, what happens when it does? Because when Harry's DNA was allegedly compared, not in whispers, but in hard scientific fact, the results were undeniable. And those results didn't point to Charles. They pointed to James Hewitt. And that revelation, if true, is nothing short of catastrophic. Here is where the monarchy's nightmare truly begins. Because rumors are one thing. Speculation can be brushed off, mocked, denied. But results, hard numbers from a DNA comparison, are different. They're not whispers in the dark. They're not grainy tabloid photos of Harry beside James Hewitt. They're science. Cold. Unflinching. Final. And according to the whispers that refused to die, when Prince Harry's DNA was compared against both King Charles and James Hewitt, the results tipped the scales in a way the palace could never spin. But let's step carefully. Imagine the process. DNA samples taken, whether officially, secretly, or through less conventional means. Swabs, strands of hair, a blood draw. These are all it takes. Run them through the lab, isolate the markers, and what do you get? A story written in genetic code. A story that either confirms Harry is Charles's son or proves the Hewitt rumors once and for all. The palace's line has always been airtight. Harry is Charles's son. Full stop. Yet notice how they've never, not once, offered DNA proof to silence the speculation. Why not? Because according to claims circulating for decades, those comparisons have already been made, and the answers were not what the Windsors wanted. The alleged results are shocking. Genetic markers aligning with Hewitt. Key sequences that make the resemblance more than coincidence. In contrast, the supposed lack of significant overlap with Charles raised questions impossible to ignore. For scientists, the evidence pointed in one direction, Hewitt. For courtiers, the only solution was suppression. Now ask yourself, what would that mean? If the DNA matches Hewitt, Harry is not biologically Charles's son. And if Harry isn't Charles's son, what happens to the foundation of his identity, his role, his very place in the royal family? Imagine being Harry. For your entire life, you've been the spare, living in your brother's shadow. You've endured the whispers, the jokes, the cruel speculation. And now you see scientific confirmation that the whispers were right. What does that do to a man? Does it free him, or does it shatter him? Perhaps both. And think about Charles, the man who raised Harry, who walked him behind Diana's coffin, who called him his son, knowing, perhaps, all along that biology said otherwise. Is Charles a victim here, betrayed by Diana? Or is he complicit, aware of the truth, but choosing silence to preserve the monarchy? Which version is more damning? Let's bring James Hewitt into the frame. For years, he denied being Harry's father. He insisted the affair began too late. Yet his denials often sounded rehearsed, leaning heavily on dates supplied by palace spin doctors. If the DNA comparisons show otherwise, then Hewitt himself carried the truth for decades, denying it in public while the evidence whispered otherwise. Was it shame, fear, or loyalty to Diana, who might have begged him to protect Harry by keeping silent? Now, step back and consider the monarchy itself. If Harry is not Charles's son, the bloodline is broken. The spare was never truly royal. And that creates constitutional chaos. It means one of the most famous members of the family, one who once stood in line to the throne, was never legitimately in line at all. The ripple effects are devastating, not just for Harry, but for the entire image of the royal family. A monarchy built on heritage cannot survive if its heritage is exposed as fiction. And yet, the palace clings to silence. Because silence, they believe, is safer than confirmation. Better to let the rumors swirl endlessly than to admit the truth and watch the crown itself tremble. Here's the cruel irony. If the results prove Hewitt is Harry's father, then the monarchy's attempts to suppress the truth for decades were wasted. Because in the modern world, secrets don't stay hidden forever. Every day, technology advances. Every year, DNA testing becomes more available. It's not a question of if the truth comes out, it's when. And when it does, the monarchy will face its greatest scandal since Edward VIII abdicated for Wallis Simpson. But pause here. What if the results are more complicated? What if the DNA showed partial overlap, raising questions but not delivering a clear answer? In science, even the slightest ambiguity can be spun into doubt. Could the palace be clinging to that ambiguity, using it as a fig leaf to dismiss the results while quietly trembling at what they reveal? Let's not forget the public. For decades, the resemblance between Harry and Hewitt has been mocked on television, whispered in pubs, dissected in newspapers. If DNA results align with Hewitt, the public will see vindication. They will say, "We knew it all along." The monarchy's denials will look hollow, deceitful, and Harry will become not just the rebel prince, but the living proof of the crown's biggest lie. Here's the emotional punch. Harry has always spoken of feeling like an outsider, of never fully belonging. In his memoir Spare, he described the coldness of royal life, the cruelty of the institution. What if those feelings weren't just emotional? What if, deep down, he always suspected they were biological too, that he was never truly one of them? DNA evidence doesn't just confirm a rumor. It rewrites a life. And now, the cliffhanger. If the DNA results point to Hewitt, then Harry is not the spare. He is not the prince the world thought he was. And that means the monarchy itself, an institution that claims its power through bloodlines, has been selling us a lie for 40 years. But if that's true, then what does it mean for the monarchy's future? For succession? For the crown itself? Because when the bloodline breaks, the crown shakes. And that's where we go next. Succession in crisis. This isn't just gossip anymore. This is a constitutional earthquake. Because if the whispers are true, if DNA confirms that Prince Harry is not the biological son of King Charles, then the crisis goes far beyond personal scandal. It tears into the very heart of monarchy itself. Succession is the monarchy's lifeblood. Without clear, legitimate lineage, the entire institution begins to wobble like a house of cards in a storm. And suddenly, the question becomes, what happens when the spare was never really royal at all? Let's step into the logic of the crown. Every rule, every tradition, every ritual from coronations to titles rests on one thing: blood. The Windsors are not elected. They are not chosen by merit. They reign because they are descendants of those who came before. Break that chain, and everything that follows is tainted. So, if Harry's bloodline is broken, what does that mean? At first glance, you might think, nothing. William is still Charles's son. William's children are still heirs. The line continues through him. But here's the problem. The monarchy isn't just about who sits on the throne. It's about perception, stability, continuity. If the public realizes they were lied to, if Harry was paraded as a Windsor while never being one, then trust in the crown shatters. And don't underestimate the danger of perception. Remember Edward VIII? He abdicated for love, yes, but what really frightened the establishment was the damage to the crown's image. The idea that a king could choose romance over duty threatened the very aura of monarchy. Now imagine the scandal of discovering that one of its most famous sons wasn't even part of the bloodline. That isn't just embarrassing. It's destabilizing. Let's also remember how close Harry once was to the throne. At birth, he was third in line, right after William. If something had happened to Charles and William in those early years, Harry could have been king. Let that sink in. The man who may not even be a Windsor could have worn the crown. What would that have meant for Britain? For the Commonwealth? For history itself? The irony is almost cruel. For years, Harry was dismissed as the spare, the backup, the one who didn't matter. Yet if the DNA rumors are true, he was never even a spare. He was an illusion, a stand-in, a symbol of stability that never truly existed. And the monarchy knew, or at least suspected, all along. Now, let's look at historical parallels. This wouldn't be the first time a royal bloodline was questioned. In medieval Europe, illegitimate heirs caused wars, literally wars of succession. Look at the Wars of the Roses. Look at Henry VIII's desperate obsession with a male heir. History shows us that when bloodlines are doubted, crowns topple. And though Britain today isn't about to plunge into civil war, the symbolic damage could be just as devastating. Think about the Commonwealth. Countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand keep the monarchy mostly out of tradition. They already debate breaking away. If Harry's paternity scandal explodes, it hands Republicans across the world their ultimate weapon. Why should we remain loyal, they'll say, to an institution that lies even about its own blood? And then there's the British public. They already question the monarchy's relevance. They already resent the money it costs. If the institution is caught covering up Harry's true paternity, public trust could plummet. And once trust is gone, support vanishes with it. But here's where the palace strategy becomes clear. They cling to silence, because admitting the truth would open the floodgates. Better to let people speculate endlessly than to face constitutional chaos. As long as the truth isn't officially confirmed, the monarchy survives. But if DNA evidence is ever made public, if it shows Harry is Hewitt's son, then the monarchy is facing its most dangerous crisis in centuries. Now pause and think about William. For him, this scandal is a nightmare wrapped in irony. On one hand, it doesn't directly affect his bloodline. His legitimacy as heir is untouched. But on the other hand, the fallout touches everything. If the public turns against the monarchy because of lies about Harry, William inherits a poisoned crown. His reign begins not in glory, but in scandal. And Harry, his brother, his rival, becomes the symbol of the monarchy's downfall. And what of Harry himself? If the succession rules are based on blood, then technically, he was never eligible in the first place. His titles, his position in the line of succession, all of it could be stripped away. Imagine the humiliation. The palace could declare that he was never a legitimate royal. Yet imagine the irony. Harry has already walked away. He and Meghan have already distanced themselves. So what happens when the institution he left behind finally admits he was never truly part of it? Is Harry vindicated or destroyed? There's another layer here. If succession depends on bloodlines, and DNA proves Harry's bloodline is broken, does that call into question other branches of the family? Diana's lovers, Charles's affairs, even whispers about other royals, all suddenly take on new weight. If Harry's paternity can be doubted, then who else's can? Once the door is open, it cannot be closed. Let's bring it back to the bigger picture. The monarchy's entire brand is continuity. From William the Conqueror to Charles III, an unbroken line of rulers. It's the story they sell to the people, to the Commonwealth, to the world. But if DNA evidence proves one of the links is missing, then the story collapses. And when the story collapses, so does the crown. So let me ask you directly. Do you think the monarchy can survive a revelation that one of its most famous princes, one who once stood third in line to the throne, is not of royal blood? Can a crown built on bloodlines endure if those bloodlines are proven false? Because the whispers are no longer just whispers. The science is out there. The results, allegedly, are already known. And the longer the palace refuses to address it, the more dangerous the truth becomes. And here's the cliffhanger. While succession may be the monarchy's biggest fear, the media smelled blood long before DNA evidence became public. The tabloids, hungry for scandal, pounced on the Hewitt rumors and turned them into front-page fire. And their coverage not only kept the story alive, it ensured the world would never, ever forget it. Which brings us to the next chapter, the media wars, and how the press turned Harry's very existence into the monarchy's most profitable scandal. The tabloids smelled blood. They always do. And when it comes to the British monarchy, nothing sells papers, nothing drives clicks, quite like scandal. The moment whispers began about Prince Harry's paternity, the press latched on like sharks circling fresh prey. Suddenly, Harry wasn't just a baby prince in a sailor's suit. He was the subject of a question that could topple a dynasty. Is Charles really his father? Now think about that for a second. Imagine growing up with your very existence turned into a headline. Every birthday, every photograph, every public appearance, shadowed by doubt. For Harry, this wasn't just gossip. It was his life. But for the media, it was a goldmine. Let's rewind to the late 1980s and early 1990s. The tabloids were ruthless, locked in a circulation war. Every paper wanted the juiciest scoop, the most shocking headline. Diana was already a favorite target, glamorous, fragile, endlessly captivating. Her unhappy marriage fed 1,000 stories. And when James Hewitt's name entered the picture, the press had its perfect narrative. The wronged princess, the dashing soldier, and the child who looked suspiciously like him. The coverage was relentless. Side-by-side photos of Harry and Hewitt plastered across front pages. Articles dissecting the shape of Harry's nose, the color of his hair, even the tilt of his smile. Late-night comedians made jokes. Cartoons mocked the royal family. Every feature of Harry's face became public property, analyzed as if he were a lab specimen rather than a child. And here's the cruel part. The palace could never completely stamp it out. They tried. Statements were issued. Courtiers whispered denials. The timeline defense was repeated endlessly. But the more they denied, the more the tabloids doubled down. Because in the world of the press, denial isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning. Do you see the irony? The monarchy, by trying to shut down the rumor, only fed it. Every time they said impossible, the public thought, then why do you sound so desperate? Silence could have killed the whispers. But the palace chose defiance. And in doing so, they kept the scandal alive. Now let's talk about perception. The public doesn't need proof. They need a story. And the story of Diana's affair with Hewitt, combined with Harry's red hair, was irresistible. It was simple, emotional, and juicy. People wanted to believe it. Because in believing it, they got to side with Diana, the princess betrayed, who found love on her own terms. Harry as Hewitt's son became not just scandalous, but almost romantic. A symbol of Diana's rebellion against the cold, cruel Windsor machine. But here's the darker side. That same perception cut Harry like a knife. Imagine sitting in a classroom as a boy, hearing other children snicker that your real dad isn't the man you call father. Imagine opening a magazine and seeing your face beside another man's, with strangers debating whether you look like him. That's not a headline. That's trauma. And Harry himself has admitted this. In interviews, in his memoir Spare, he spoke about the cruelty of the press, the endless invasion, the sense of never being able to escape. While William was portrayed as the golden heir, Harry was cast as the mischievous Spare, wild, reckless, always under suspicion. And layered beneath all those portrayals was the unspoken question, does he even belong? The media didn't just report on the rumor. They weaponized it. They used it to create a narrative of Harry as the outsider, the other. And over time, that narrative became self-fulfilling. Harry leaned into it. The rebellious prince. The soldier who went to war. The man who would eventually turn his back on the institution entirely. In many ways, the press didn't just shape public perception of Harry. They shaped Harry himself. Now pause here. Think about Diana's role. She despised the press when it turned on her, but she also knew how to use it. She leaked stories. She gave interviews. She understood the power of perception. And sometimes, whether deliberately or not, she left enough ambiguity around her affair with Hewitt to keep the press guessing. Was it her way of striking back at Charles? Was it her attempt to keep control of her own story? Or was it simply that the truth was too dangerous to spell out? Either way, the result was the same. The press feasted, and Harry suffered. And here's where perception becomes dangerous. Because when a rumor is repeated enough, it begins to feel like truth. Ask yourself, how many people around the world believe, deep down, that James Hewitt is Harry's father? Even without proof, even with palace denials, millions do. That's the power of media. It doesn't just report reality. It shapes it. Now let's not forget the modern era. Social media turned the whispers into a roar. Memes, tweets, viral videos, images of Harry beside Hewitt circulate constantly. In an age where conspiracy theories thrive, the rumor has only grown stronger. And every time Harry criticizes the monarchy, every time he distances himself, the online echo chamber says, of course he left. He was never one of them. This is where the media's role becomes more than scandal. It becomes prophecy. By painting Harry as the outsider for decades, they set the stage for his eventual exile. When he left Britain with Meghan, It wasn't just about love or freedom. It was about finally stepping into the role the media had written for him since birth, the rebel prince. But here's the twist. What if Harry knows more than he lets on? What if his anger at the press, his resentment toward his family, his relentless drive to tell his story all stem from something deeper? The knowledge, or at least the suspicion, that the press was right all along, that the story mocked as rumor was actually truth? And here's the cliffhanger. While the media kept the rumor alive for decades, it wasn't Harry who would add the most fuel to the fire. It wasn't even Diana. It was James Hewitt himself, forced again and again to answer the question he couldn't escape. And the way he answered, well, it only made the fire burn hotter.